Stand clear.
100% Wild Podcast.
So for all you listeners,
hello and welcome to
definitely not your favorite outdoor podcast.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Drury Outdoors 100% Wild Podcast, powered by DeerCast. This is episode number 320. I am Tim Chelsvik.
I'm Matt Drury.
And we've got special guests in from the Missouri Department of Conservation. We've got Nick Oakley, who's the biologist for wild turkey and ruffed grouse. And we've got Jason Sumners, who's the Deputy Director of Resource Management.
And we have Mark Drury on Zoom from Iowa.
Oh, yeah, Mark's here, too.
So what's up, guys?
How's
everybody doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having us.
We're all a little slow this morning because we're all recovering from turkey season.
Yeah.
In fact, Mark just got in from hunting up in Iowa, so it takes a few days to recover.
Yeah, last week I lied. I said that was going to be our last turkey episode of the season, but we had an opportunity. Mark, Terry, and myself were at the grand opening, and Tim Chelsvik were at the grand opening of the new Bass Pro Store here in Sunset Hills, Missouri, St. Louis area. And we had an opportunity to run into a few folks, and one from the MDC that said, hey, you know what, we're doing some pretty cool stuff. We should have you guys, or you guys should have us come in and talk about it on the podcast. And we threw it together pretty quickly, and you guys were able to come in for Columbia. So it was a good opportunity, and we wanted to make sure we jumped on top of it. So
yeah, we're really kind of focusing on the trouble with turkeys. Like, what is really going on with turkey populations, not only in Missouri, but across the country. And so MDC is kind of at the leading edge of the research. And I know that we'll talk about some of the levers that we're able to pull in terms of impacting the population. But first, let's jump in and kind of get your guys' background, establish your bona fides, and then let's talk about what you're seeing as a department.
Yeah, so my name's Nick Oakley, as we discussed. I'm the wild turkey and ruffed grouse biologist. I was born and raised in Boone County, so that's where Columbia is, there in central Missouri. Went to the University of Missouri for my undergrad degrees. Worked for Department of Conservation as a youngster, as an undergrad.
Child labor?
Yeah.
I was 8 years old.
Yeah. That'd have been all right. Better than some of the other work I was doing at 8. Actually, one of my first jobs was for Jason. We were clover trapping deer just south of Columbia. But yeah, so I got my undergrad degrees there. I got one in forestry and then another in wildlife biology. And then decided it was time to leave, time to fly the coop. So I went out west and did some field work in a variety of different western states. Ended up in Wyoming for grad school, where I did a behavioral ecology project that not wildly relevant as far as the species I was covering. It was a tropical songbird. But I learned a lot about ecology and behavioral ecology in particular, which I think actually does tie in pretty well with turkeys as far as the lek maters and things like that. I came back to Missouri. My wife got a job with the Department of Conservation as one of our disease specialists, our wildlife health specialists. So I was able to get back in, get my foot in the door, and then things kind of fell my way, and I ended up in this position.
Nice.
All right, Nick's too smart to be here.
Finally, someone knows what they're talking about. A real scientician.
Yeah, hire good people, right? Yeah,
That's right.
Nick mentioned he was actually the first hourly I hired when I came back to the department.
Geez.
So, yeah, we've been working together for a long time. Yeah, Jason Sumners. I serve as deputy director. I got here via West Central Missouri. Grew up in Missouri. Went to the University of Missouri, fish and wildlife degree like Nick. Then I took a tour through the South. Got a master's degree at Mississippi State with Steve Damaris, certainly a familiar name for probably many of your listeners. And then in 2000, late 2008, 2009, got the chance to come back to Missouri as our first private lands deer program person. And then we found CWD and decided to reintroduce elk. And I say, my life in the agency changed. Certainly stressed and challenged me. But then about 9 months ago, I guess now, Deputy Director Hubbard, who was one of our former turkey biologists, retired, and I got the opportunity to step up into agency leadership in the role of Director of Resource Management, where this responsibility, I have responsibility for all of our public and private land management staff, all of our research staff, as well as our law enforcement team.
It sounds like you did your part this turkey season by by preserving a few turkeys and
Yeah.
letting them roam free still.
Yeah. I participate in the catch and release portion of the turkey season.
Tim and I are good at that for all seasons.
Yeah. We're not really big into the killing part. It's like sitting out there. And Mark, we've got to find some university to give you an honorary doctorate in turkey hunting.
It's really just a doctorate in lack of sleep this time of year.
Mark is delirious.
Yeah, there's probably some sleep studies somewhere that could benefit from turkey hunting.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, you look at a graph and you time out like
Yeah.
where your sleep deprivation happens and it all correlates with April and May.
That's right.
It's really not sleep. It's just a series of naps for about a month and a half. That's all it is.
Yeah. Gross. All right. So let's jump into it then. Like, what's at the top of your guys' list for, because I know that there are a lot of questions out there, but what are some of the hot buttons that you're looking at right now?
I'd say I'll jump in first, and I'll let Nick talk a little bit about what's going on. You know, kind of the world around turkey management across much of the Midwest and even in the Southeast, you know, things were booming through the late 80s, early 90s, even into, you know, about the turn of the early 2000s. Then the system really started to change. So we have a lot of research that dates back to like the 1980s. There's some real foundational kinds of things, and Missouri was right at the forefront of that. I mean, doing some of the seminal work that really established what we know about turkeys and turkey management, and things were going well. And so we have this big gap, quite honestly, across the country from kind of the late 90s to the 2010s, where folks are like, things are great. We're not going to do a lot. We did some survival kinds of things. And then in kind of around the early, you know, mid to late 2000s, folks started to notice things weren't shaping up the way that we thought. And so we kicked off, and I'll let Nick talk about it a little bit, we kicked off a big research project in North Missouri to really start to ask some questions of, what are we doing in terms of harvest rates? Are we shooting too many gobblers? How many hens are we shooting? What's survival? What's kind of some preliminary baseline information look like? And so Jason Isbell, our previous turkey biologist, kind of finished that work up. And really things looked not typically out of alignment in terms of we very, very low harvest rates on gobblers, good survival, reasonably good hen survival, reasonably representative nest initiation, all those kinds of key factors. But what we started to narrow in on was this question about poult survival and poult production. And so that really is the story, I think, in so many ways across much of the country, is this question of production. We don't really have adult bird survival problems in most cases. Some places where we've had long hunting seasons and have certainly been overshooting them, especially some places across the Southeast where seasons are super long. So we've really been targeting this question about production, and so that's kind of where the current project is focused at.
Is it because, you know, kind of the eye test, it isn't, you know, it's like you talk to hunters across the country and it's like, man, the numbers just aren't what they used to be. And it's like, well, you know, your research is showing that a lot of things are still kind of status quo, but there's something that's happening out there that people were having a problem putting their finger on, right?
Yeah. And so when we started with some of the first big questions, it's like, well, things with survival look normal. Things with nest initiation look normal. So you just you start with the big ones and then you start narrowing it down and saying, okay, what are those other suite of questions we haven't gotten to yet that might help better explain what's going on? And so that's kind of where we are now.
Yeah, exactly. So Jason's project kind of identified potentially what the issue is, but it was never really designed to get at why it was happening, right? It wasn't designed to see why poult production was in decline. So he actually, with the University of Missouri researchers, started kind of starting this new project, putting it together. So we're looking specifically at why are poults not surviving at rates like they were in the 80s. So things like insect abundance or changes in weather patterns, habitat certainly is a big component. Predator densities, have they changed or are they driving this relationship? So that's really what this project's getting at a really focused way over, you know, a 4 or 5 year timeline, which is great. It's kind of one of the early projects to really focus in on this question. It's a long project, and it's using the most up-to-date technology that we can. So it's really exciting. You know, we're in year 3. This is field season 3 of the 5 year project. So there's no real results yet, unfortunately, but we're getting there, and they're collecting an enormous amount of data, just terabytes of data.
Nick, are other DNRs, Departments of Conservation across the country, are they coming to the same conclusions that Missouri has, that it's really about poults and poult production?
Yeah, overwhelmingly, it seems that across the country we're seeing these productions decline. So what we do in Missouri is we do a spring brood survey, and Missouri is one of the early states again for that. We started doing our brood survey in 1959, and you can see kind of a period from 59 to about 1970, excuse me, where we see some increasing production, right, as we're starting to move birds around the state. They're colonizing new areas. They're starting to take off. The population's growing at that point. Then from about 1970 to 1985, we're at this really high level of production, 3-4 poults per hen per year on average, like really high production. After about 1985, we really see kind of just a steady decline in production to where we are now. Within the last 5 years, production is around one poult per hen. So down pretty significantly. And that trend, maybe not those specific numbers, but that trend has been seen across much of the country.
So statistically then, do you even consider that turkeys are replacing themselves if they're at one hen to one poult ratio?
That would be low. I mean, that's on the level of what we're concerned about. Are they replacing themselves? We'd like to see a little higher. So when we look at a poult per hen ratio, though, it's really more of an index. So we can't draw a ton of really firm conclusions about is it true on average across the state that hens are producing one poult per hen. It's just a way of comparing our data year over year over year, essentially.
You're looking at trends.
It's a trend, exactly.
Yeah, it's hard to put it to an actual quantifiable number, and then we certainly have had some questions about whether that number is still accurate.
Yeah.
And the way that reporting has changed. A lot of early on, there's a lot of rural mail carriers are doing a lot of those surveys for us, but the population is sustaining itself, and so it definitely begs that question. But to what's happening in other places, you just see that similar pattern. It's just a matter of when were they done with restoration? When was the population done? So they may be 5 or 10 years behind us in some cases in terms of the course of the population. And I think we always knew that expanding and colonizing populations go through these sort of boom and bust, and the question is where's the bottom, right? Where's the point at which it's going to stabilize? Are we there? Is it lower? Could it be higher? I think that's a huge question so many of us have.
For Missouri, what was the boom in like the period of the top of the bell curve? What was that period?
That was in the early 2000s. So
Early 2000s.
our peak harvest, which is our best kind of metric for abundance, was in 2004.
Well, peak harvest, is that a fair data point considering if hunter numbers are declining a little bit? I mean, I don't know if that's, you guys would have the data more so than we do, but it seems like hunting numbers in general are declining somewhat.
Yeah, so in Missouri, we've held on, and our total number of deer and turkey hunters didn't peak out until about 2012, 2013. So we've sustained ourselves through that, and even more recently, it's been a more of a trickle than it has been kind of just pouring out of the bottom. So I don't think that's really driving it. It's certainly we can talk about fall harvest, but it's certainly a clear indicator in fall harvest, right? Fall harvest participation, it is so closely correlated with production and trend of the population. As production went high, fall hunter numbers went up, and then it just drops right off as numbers went down too. So, but I don't think it's really necessarily a product of number of hunters out there. Because you look at success rates and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, so let's dig in then to what are some of the lead culprits or potentials for troubles with poult production.
Yeah, so I think the one that everyone probably is most familiar with and interested in would be predation. So we can just address that, get that one right out in front. So it's probably likely that predator numbers have increased over the last 20 years or so. that could be both numbers and densities in certain areas. As the landscape changes and we start to lose some of that really good high quality turkey habitat, it also starts to move birds into tighter areas, which makes predation a little more effective. However, I think ultimately it's the habitat that drives that relationship as much as the predator numbers. So, for example, we could add some percentage more turkey brood rearing habitat that would kind of lessen the effect that predation would even have on the poult production. And we see that as we go back in the 80s, right? So we've got all these big landscape changes. Things are changing over. We're changing how we manage the land. We're changing how we farm the land, how we graze the land, and that I think as kind of a side effect actually made for some pretty good, though ephemeral, turkey habitat. We're no longer there. Things have settled in, right? Those fescue pastures are now very established, and that's no longer, prime habitat. That's very mediocre to even maybe perhaps poor habitat, things like that. So, that's one of the things that we really focus on, because that's something we can change, right? That's something we can promote. We can get folks fired up and interested about is changing their habitat, improving the habitat, because that's, I think, really what's going to make a difference. And we see higher poult production in areas, right? You talk to farmers and landowners who've done the work, who've gone in with their chainsaw and drip torch, and they talk about seeing great turkey numbers. And we have a PLC that I've worked with, one of our private lands conservationists, who's done work on his family farm in Osage County, so on the south side of the Missouri River. And he said that 15 years ago they had terrible turkey numbers there, right? When everything else was peaking around the state, his numbers were in the tank. Couldn't find a turkey. Over the last 3 or 4 years, after they've done all the work, he says they are seeing turkeys. They're back in that stand on a ridge and pick which one you want to go to.
Oh, nice.
That's anecdotal, of course, but you hear it often enough. There's got to be a kernel of truth there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and Mark, I know that you guys do a lot of work in kind of keeping tabs on turkey numbers on your properties. Maybe talk about what you've seen as you guys continue to manage the landscape for turkeys, how that has impacted the numbers.
We do. We started seeing a decline probably about a decade to 12 years ago. And, you guys know how passionate I am about turkeys, more so than deer. And it was concerning to me. So we did a few different things to try and be proactive. One of the things that we've done that I think's really helped is just our own management, managing ourselves, our trigger finger, and making sure that what we felt was the average population on a farm or a parcel that we hunted was sustaining through time as opposed to declining. So we started keeping track of, hey, how many birds are we hearing here annually, and comparing that through time? How many jakes are we visibly seeing either on trail camera surveys or during the spring hunting period, keeping track of that through time. And we've started to make our decisions on whether we shoot a turkey in a certain area or not based on that historical average. And we've got several years to say, hey, we typically hear 4 to 6 birds on this parcel, and why are we only hearing 1 or 2 this year? Well, that is a no-shoot situation for us, especially if we're not seeing jakes. And I'm using just examples. However, if all of a sudden we're hearing 8 in there and we're seeing 7 or 8 jakes, then we're gonna manage it and probably kill 2 or 3 birds. So we've managed ourselves and tried to help the population in conjunction with an aggressive approach on predators, both nest predation and coyotes, and of course habitat improvement, food plots. We try to do every single thing we can to give them every advantage they can have. And I would say right now I have as many turkeys on our different properties as I've ever seen. But we've been doing this for over a decade. And the other thing that I've done is branched out and not put all the pressure on a parcel. I've gone and I've leased some additional ground. I've gained permission on other ground. And there's people we go hunt with and film with that we don't ever hunt their property, but they allow us to come in and assist them, but keeps us in the game. We're still enjoying the sport, but we're not, stressing the populations on other farms. So we've spread out where our hunting tactics and pressure go. And all of those things combined, we have a fairly healthy population right now. It's really worked for us.
It's probably a great point to make in terms of, we talk macro level all the time, but we all have some level of impact on the turkey population. So just the personal responsibility we all have about maybe avoiding some of the spots that are lower on turkey numbers, or not taking the second bird if you have two birds to, two tags to fill in the state that you're in.
Yeah, I've got a story about that one. The year that I think it was 2011, we brought elk back from Kentucky for the first time, restored elk, and so I'd spent most of the spring in Kentucky. I got to hunt the last 2 days, and at the in-laws farm, there's this beautiful ridge, open in the pasture, nice big roosting timber to the edges. They just love to fly down. Father-in-law's like, been 2 birds up there. They've been strutting. They've been carrying on. So got 2 days left.
Get 'em.
Got 2 birds, right? Saturday, bird flies down, shoot him. Go back. Sunday morning, bird flies down, shoot him. It was 5 years, and we didn't see another turkey using the top of that ridge. I was like, whoa. What's going on here?
Grim Reaper came through.
Yeah, they had loved it, and part of this is, again, part of the declining production too. But yeah, it started to trigger into my mind some of those just behave. I mean, these are a very social animal, right? They are very social. And so it does make you wonder about some of those things that there are places on the landscape they like to be. And if you do something that unintentionally disrupts that, you don't know what the consequences are. But yeah, to your point, Mark, it's made me kind of wonder about some of those things, especially as we have smaller populations and those small little disturbances that we get. The flip side of it is that sometimes it can lead us down the path of thinking of turkeys like deer, right? That it's a harvest limited, production based. I mean, this thing's based on production. We aren't really limiting the populations through harvest in most cases, so we don't need to be overly cautious, but I think super mindful of just some of the decisions that we're making.
So while we're still kind of on the topic of nest predation, one of the things that I hear a lot of hunters talk about is just the decline in what they can get for, the fur, when they're trapping. And so that has been blamed a little bit for, some of the lack of, I guess, hunters out there doing the typical trapping that they used to in, say, the 80s or 90s or whatnot. And there's some states that have gotten aggressive with that. What was it we were talking about? Was it South Dakota?
They're doing bounties, again.
Is that something that the department has ever looked at or thought of as to, not to put you on the spot, but putting you on the spot, that's the type of questions that I hear. So I'm relaying it to you guys. Is that something you've discussed? Is it something that would even make a difference, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I think it's a complicated system, right? I mean, turkeys are certainly a prey species. We know things, and Nick was talking about a little bit, these larger landscape scale things that are occurring that aren't just Missouri specific, right? So there are things that are happening on our landscape in the Midwest and the Southeast, wherever, that are certainly different than they used to be. And no doubt there's declining participation in trapping. I sometimes want to caution people, too, that they think we'll go back to the 1980s when trapping was supposedly controlling populations. Raccoon and other fur bear populations were increasing during that time. Were we harvesting enough to slow down population growth? Absolutely. But they were still on the path to recovery, right? I mean, we had very few of them. They recovered a little quicker than some other things. So no doubt, at the peak in the 80s, we were selling 250, 300,000 raccoon pelts. And, last year I think they sold 25,000. So there's no doubt there's a pretty dramatic decline. The bounty side of things would be super hard for us probably actually to kill enough, even with a bounty system. I do some calculations, if we thought we would incentivize folks to get back to doing 250,000 raccoons,
it's a lot of
how
money.
much money would it cost?
Yeah.
Is it gonna take $10? Is it gonna take $20? If it takes $20 a raccoon, we're talking $5 million a year to maybe not even make a dent in the population. Yeah. So where would we be better served to invest $5 million? And we firmly believe that no doubt do predator populations play an impact on a prey species. There's no doubt they do. Sure. But our opportunity for success is through really active and aggressive habitat management. And then you add on some predator management or controls of some of those populations, some thoughtful controls of those populations, you can't have additive value.
Because you talk about, the habitat management. I think Mark and Terry and the guys like Bobby Cole over at Gamekeepers, Mossy Oak, like they live that side of the lifestyle, and they've seen they benefited from it on definitely on the whitetail side. And, they're doing all these things, and it's like, man, it's, but yet we might see a decline in the turkey population. So as Mark alluded to, years ago, they got aggressive and changing what they're doing. But part of that change was nest predation and making sure that they were in front of that. And I know specifically for like Terry's farm in Northeast Missouri, the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years, they've been very aggressive in trapping. And he said he's seeing his population just explode. So here's a place where it's basically a state park. They've been doing the wildlife management side for years, for decades. And here's a direct eye test again, correlation to the nest predation and getting in front of that. And it's like, wow, we're seeing, numbers that we haven't seen in a long time. Mark, is that, would you agree with that?
100%. I mean, I used to hunt Terry's all the time. And when we first started hunting, that's a 1,200 acre parcel he's referring to. And I would say probably 80% of it is timber and cover. When we first started hunting there was turkeys literally on every ridge, every point. And slowly but surely, in those same years that Jason referred to earlier, the turkey population declined. And of course, we all got proactive. What do we do? What do we do? And Terry, they have waged war on the raccoons during trappitt season. And Forrest was just here hunting in Iowa with us, and he goes, I can't catch a raccoon right now. He goes, we have caught so many and taken that population close to zero as far as he was concerned. He goes, it takes 4 nights with 50 sets to catch one coon. And he was catching, 20 or 30 a night. Of course, he stopped when the season ended in Missouri, April the whatever it was, 1st or 14th. But they've been doing that now for several years, and they just keep having these great hatches. So is that coincidental with the weather patterns, or is it truly, the raccoons doing that, or the lack thereof? So through time, we'll find out, hopefully. But certainly it's having a positive effect based on what Terry can tell. So and of course, they're doing other habitat improvement as well with additional TSI. They're fire burning on an annual basis, food plots everywhere, and also making those management decisions on what they shoot and when they shoot. That was the one thing I did not mention. Another thing we changed that was a drastic change for us, about 4 or 5 years ago, we had talked to Dr. Chamberlain, and he mentioned some research pointing to the fact that only certain gobblers are participating in the breeding. And we've started to lay off. When we see a gobbler with a bunch of hens, we've started to lay off that situation. Whereas in the past, we'd be like, that's the boss gobbler, let's go get him. Now we're like, that may be the breeding tom in the area. Let's let him do all the breeding he can. We've also delayed harvest as late as we possibly can on many farms, especially those that are stressed. I mentioned this morning we killed a turkey and all these birds were alone. None had hens with them. One of them had one hen. But later in the season, when you do that harvest, you kind of in your mind like, these hens should be nested and the breeding has occurred and you don't feel like you're interrupting the breeding cycle. That change as well, in my opinion, has helped us up here. So that's another key prong to the approach we've taken up here.
And Mark, yeah, season timing absolutely critical, and that's that's the bulk of the changes of turkey season, especially spring seasons that we've seen. Is a lot of it is the product of many states in the South, in particular, had really early, really long seasons. We've had a very conservative season in Missouri where the opening day is intended to be at or after the peak of nest initiation, right? And so trying to be into that later time period. So when you see a lot of changes that have happened in a lot of other states, they really are looking more and more like the Missouri season structure than, months on end where you're shooting toms way early in the season before. It's the same. It's not terribly different than some of the disruptive things that happened for deer harvest in the Southeast when we were shooting a ton of bucks way early in the season, right? And caused some disruptions there. So again, certainly critical, but I think one of the criticisms we certainly receive is that Missouri hasn't made a ton of changes. We're not responding to the change. Well, when you look to where others are going, they're going to the season structure or something very similar to what we have, and we're certainly keeping an eye on what's happening.
Sure.
Do you guys have some sort of hunch or numbers in terms of what Missouri's population was, an estimated population, say in 1990, and let's say every decade, and where we're at right now in an overall population? Do you have a rough number estimation?
Yeah, so the way Missouri has done it, and other states I know do it as well, is it's about 10 times what the spring harvest was. So if you look back at the spring harvest, multiply that by 10, that's kind of roughly what we think the population is. They've done some modeling work that supports that as like a pretty good, rough, back-of-the-envelope calculation. So in the 90s, we would have been somewhere between 400 and 500,000 birds. Peak 2004. Again, we're using harvest data, so there are some caveats to that. But in the mid 2000s, we peaked at around maybe 600,000 birds. This year, using our numbers, we shot about almost 45,000 birds this spring, including the youth season. So, it's about a 20% decrease or 25% decrease from that peak in 2004. But it's not actually that far off from where we were in the mid 90s as far as harvest goes overall.
And it's amazing to me just how personal experience plays into your kind of global sense of how turkeys are doing. The last couple of years have been really difficult. This past year, I've heard more gobbling and had more encounters than I have in a long, long time. And so, like, if I just kind of gauge how I feel, I'm like, turkey season's pretty good. I guess turkeys are, they're doing okay. But that's just my small sliver perspective of the state.
And we see a lot of variation year to year, right? So if we have a couple of good hatches in a row, all of a sudden, man, we got gobblers coming out of our ears, right? So if you look at production 2 years ago, those are our 2-year birds now, 2-year-old birds now. Production took a real hard decline in 2016 and 2017, but then it slowly kind of crept back up. And we're holding steady. It's a little lower than we like it, as I've said, but we're holding steady. And so I think seeing that little bump in production is absolutely showing. I mean, our harvest has increased each of the last 3 years. So I think that's a direct correlation with our production numbers as well.
Were those wet springs, 16 and 17, or?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I talked to Jason Isabel, the biologist, then if he had like a sense for why he thought production just hit the skids there, and he said that there was nothing in particular that stood out to him at the time that was like obviously what the driver was. I'm sure some of it was weather, absolutely. I mean, it's hard. Whenever you see really bad production, it's often weather driven. But yeah, there wasn't something that he could put his finger on because I wanted to know that myself.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think in those pretty severe extremes, right? It's not what's the natural wave of this thing look like, and much of the real wet spring, the real dry spring, the whatever were anecdotes, I think, of us trying to put our finger on what's really happening. How do we rationalize our observations and try to provide some explanation as to what's going on? One thing Mark did bring up was all the habitat management, and I think what I'd like for folks to focus on is it's a yes and discussion. It really should be a yes and. It's not predators or it's not only habitat. There is a interplay here of what's going on. And one of the things I think we've recognized that we sort of unintentionally stumbled into, as well as Mark mentioned all the TSI that's happening. We absolutely have encouraged folks to do timber stand improvement, open the canopy, get a flush of undergrowth. Well, if somebody does that and then a landowner attempts to implement prescribed fire and it doesn't go the way they hoped it would and they get scared of using fire in those systems, it quickly becomes too woody to be really good brood rearing habitat. And so while folks are doing some habitat work, I think early on they can have some success, but then it quickly grows into something that a turkey, especially a hen trying to raise a brood, is not going to want to use. I mean, they're a visual, trying to avoid predators from that standpoint. Deer are trying to avoid predators with their nose, right? So a hen wants to be able to stick her head up and see, and you want the ground to be clear enough that her small little poults can make their way through it. And so if you do a bunch of good habitat management for whitetails, right, trying to create good thick cover, if you don't run fire through that frequently enough, or at least portions of it, it doesn't all have to look the same. Portions of it to keep that really early, really short herbaceous layer, then you're in some ways maybe potentially being a little counterproductive to having good brood rearing habitat.
Sure. Now, Go ahead,
Do you
Mark.
guys see a correlation in terms of overall CRP acres and CRP programs and overall nesting habitat? Do you guys ever look at that in your studies? Like, hey, what programs are they pushing right now, or how many acres are in, or how many have they reduced, or how many are coming out? Is there any correlation to that nationwide in terms of overall production?
Yeah, you certainly see peaks and valleys with a lot of game bird species based on the CRP acres that are out there. One of the things that has been beneficial is kind of mid-contract management for CRP, because in many cases it just turns into real thick grass and fescue, or even a mature stand of warm season grass isn't good brood rearing habitat. It's a place a turkey can survive and they'll hatch and nest there, but it is not a good place to raise poults. Yeah, it's too thick. So a lot of, even on the quail management side of things, a lot of summer and early fall burning, which really suppresses the grasses and encourages a more forb-based herbaceous layer. Our places, over like in Carroll County where they're producing a lot of quail, are places they're doing a lot of summer and fall burning to really suppress the grass. And so you got these really cool landscapes, they're beautiful, right? Because you're getting a lot of native flowers and stuff like that into those systems. They got a lot of quail and they're seeing a lot more turkey production as a result too.
Is early burning, is that worse for the turkey population? If you're burning like early spring, late winter, that type of stuff, does it matter?
They like it. They absolutely love it. It's some of the best places to hunt, right?
Sure.
They and probably you get a little early green flush, and there's probably some early insects there. But it does tend to favor grasses, which become thicker, which become wet, right? So one of the challenges I think we run into in wet springs is those poults are subject to hypothermia. Right, they get wet. They're wandering around in grass. They're not very big. They can't regulate their body temperature. So not only torrential rains, but just that cold, wet makes it hard for them to survive.
Gotcha.
Based on what I understand about poults is that they need a lot of protein as they're growing, and so insects make up a big chunk of their diet. And one of the conversations we had with Dr. Grant Woods was the impact of neonicotinoids, the insecticides that a lot of farmers are using seeds coated with these things, and they're pervasive across the ag industry. So maybe dip into that one.
Yeah, it's something that I know a lot of folks are looking at. I don't know if it's easy to draw a direct causation, right? There's correlation between we saw neonicotinoid coated seeds come onto the scene. We saw.
And when was that?
I think it was in the 80s, I believe,
Okay.
or maybe a little later. That's a good question, and not something that I'm super duper familiar with. But as we saw neonicotinoids come onto the scene, we saw production was also in decline during that time, and so people put those two together, and they're like, well, maybe this is what's causing it. Now, I don't know if it's causal, but certainly there's a correlation there, and it's part of the work that I know people are doing, especially in the waterfowl world. I know that we've got some waterfowl research going on, or did previously at the agency. As far as the project going on up north, I'm not sure that they have a neonicotinoid specific component to that, but they definitely are looking at not only insect abundance, but diversity as well. So if we still have the same biomass of insects, but it's the wrong type of insects, right, then that's really not helping our poults.
Yeah.
When we remember in a poult that stands 4 or 5 inches tall, can't forage that effectively, especially if it's thick vegetation like Jason was talking about. So there's probably a certain type of insect that they're really going after. And if those are in lower abundance, that has a negative effect certainly. And so things like insecticides are also, to throw it into the pile of things that may be affecting turkeys, right? Insecticides, pretty ubiquitous on the landscape as well. Someone told me an anecdote. They're like, yeah, when's the last time you had to pull off the highway to clean your windshield, right? With a squeegee. I remember that as a kid. We'd actually pull over at a gas station just to clean the windshield off. I haven't done that in a while. There's fewer insects maybe. That's concerning, whenever we think about that as the primary food source for a poult for the first, month of their life. Yeah.
I personally think that's one of the big deals. I mean, you just don't see the insects out there that we used to, and to me, there's a direct correlation between. I mean, you can't get seed right now that's not coated, and I think the MDC's gone away from the coated seed, have you not? Everything that you guys now supply through the Turkey Federation or through your different outlets is non-coated, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we do the best we can. We have an ag crop program. We use row crop farming on 40 or 50,000 acres of MDC owned and managed lands every year, and that we've moved away from neonic coated seeds as part of that. You can get it. You got to order it before the season and tell them not to coat it because it's gonna get coated. But because we do have, especially in some of our grassland systems, some evidence of some real long-term maintenance of neonics in the system and some definitely lower insect abundance. And so many of these things feel like it's a death by 1,000 cuts for the poor turkey. In many ways, it's just chipping away at the population in slow and subtle ways. But I think this is a big one that we, continue to scratch our head at, though, is like, okay, but does that explain lower turkey abundance in the Ozarks, where we don't use a lot of low row crop agriculture, but maybe that's where the dominant change has been habitat composition, certainly changes in predator abundance and other things. So I think it's a combination of factors certainly influencing them.
Every one of them's a walking miracle. I always say that when you see a turkey walking through the woods, it is a miracle walking in front of you, And to that point, Jason, I think it has a lot to do with our Midwest, but you take the Ozarks, my place down in Texas that I hunt, I have a spot down there that they're nice enough to allow us to hunt. This guy owns 50,000 acres, no cattle, they fire burn, it's optimum habitat. He's got rivers running through the place. And in the last 6-7 years, we've seen like the most abundant turkey population, and they're approaching zero right now. Like it has been devastating down there. They cannot get a hatch to save their behinds, and I don't know what's going on. Some of that's weather related. They've had extremely hot summers the last 2 or 3 years, and I think that's probably led to a lack of production. But man, you talk about depressing. A few years ago, we went down all limited out and never blinked. This year, we each went and killed one bird and felt a little guilty. And this is 50,000 acres, I mean, there should be birds everywhere, and there's just not anymore. So, and there's no seeds going in the ground. They're neonic coated. So.
Yeah, I had a discussion with the director from Oklahoma just a couple weeks ago, and he's like, Western Oklahoma, same kind of story. He's like, I didn't think we would ever run out of turkeys out here, but production is not what it once was.
I've stopped hunting Western Oklahoma because of that. We used to have more birds. That's where Drew Outdoors got its start. Our first out-of-state trip, 2 of them, we went to Arkansas and then Western Oklahoma. And I continue to go to Western Oklahoma for over 30 years, but I've stopped because the population has declined to the point that I don't feel like it's, a smart move to go out there and be there myself, much less promote, hunting in that area. So we try to do all we can to be, with programs like this, raise awareness, in terms of trapping and habitat improvement and neonic coated seed. The more things we all do as conservationists and stewards of our own ground and own resources, the better it can be long term, in my opinion. So, if you look back 4 or 5 years ago, I wasn't hearing every podcast and television show talking about how important trapping is for turkeys. Mm-hmm. Now you do. And in turn, I went to the Turkey Federation show this year, and I heard more people talking about trapping than I did turkey hunting. So you can turn the tides and make influence what happens out there on the landscape. And you guys are so gracious to come and share all your knowledge with us today, because I do think it makes a difference. Knowledge is power, and it certainly is when it comes to managing wildlife.
Yeah, folks want to do something, right? I mean, we hear that all the time. We want to do something. They want us to change regulations. Well, gosh, I wish that would solve the problem, but it's not going to. The thing we can do is pick up a chainsaw and a drip torch. I mean, that's the sweat equity that kind of has to go into having our sleepless last 3 weeks, right? Is the rest of the year thinking about what can we do, and especially in a state like Missouri and many other states, 93% privately owned, and really landowners do have the opportunity with the right kind of work. And we got a team of private lands conservationists that are there and happy to help assist landowners in any way they can, provide guidance and direction. There's lots of federal cost share dollars available. We have state cost share dollars. Many other states have the same kinds of programs to help landowners implement good habitat work on their lands. And now with the focus, really around turkeys, what are those programs? And so we've kicked off a turkey habitat initiative. We've hired a turkey habitat coordinator, Megan Duffy Yates, to work with Nick and with our private land staff to really start to describe what is turkey habitat and what's it look like and what kinds of programs and management practices should we be implementing to get to that state.
Well, the April edition of the Missouri Conservationist magazine, you guys did a whole piece on a private landowner who is instituting a lot of those practices on their own, and then also highlighting the support and resources that the Department of Conservation makes available. And that's not just in Missouri. There are other DNRs that are available in different states that do that kind of private land assistance.
Yeah, there's a lot of federal cost share dollars through NRCS, through USDA, soil and water conservation districts that are there to help, help a landowner at least recover some of the cost of doing that habitat work, and then the technical assistance as to what it takes to actually accomplish
Are
it.
there a few, top 2 or 3 programs that you would recommend? Because I know, I'm fairly new landowner, and when I talk to the office, I'm like, well, what do you? They're like, what are you doing on your land, or what do we need to sign up for? It's like, you tell me. I have no idea. Where do you start? I mean, do you have a general direction that you could kind of point people towards to get started?
Yeah, I think, certainly for Missouri, the first place to start is just a conversation with your private lands conservationist, and because it's alphabet and acronym soup when it comes to all of the various cost share programs that are available to you. The biggest thing is, what are you after? What are your constraints? And if they understand that, then they can try to figure out which program is the right one based on size, based on a whole host of other things that might influence your applicability, whether you're going to qualify or not for those practices. And then we have our own landowner assistance cost share program that's intended to fill some of those gaps. So here's federal programs, here's some gaps that actually exist, and so there's a state program to support that. So unfortunately, there's not necessarily an easy answer to that, but it's what are you after, and then just really good conversation.
Yeah, that's been my experience with our private lands conservationists. They love talking about it. They want to get you the cost share. They will help you make your application for that, especially that federal cost share, as good as it can possibly be. I had to convince my parents, who have about 75 acres that I hunt on, that it's time to start doing some management. Nick Oakley, the turkey biologist, had to convince his parents
What
to
do you know?
I know. Well, exactly. They're like, well, I don't know, man. I was like, all right, I'm going to have a guy come out and talk to you.
Someone who's not me.
Exactly. He took me to the side and he's like, all right, so what do you want to do? I was like, this is what I'm thinking. He's like, okay. So then we went and talked to my parents, and they're like, oh, that sounds great.
It's a great idea.
We'd love to do a pollinator planting. And I was like, okay.
Never experienced that with Terry.
So maybe talk about the interplay then with other nonprofit or non-governmental organizations.
Yeah, so NWTF is a big partner, of course. We're in Dehawks right now. They've got some funding, that some programs that, if we can put together an application in time, maybe this year, definitely next year, that we could start either supplementing some of those cost shares in areas that are underrepresented, things like that. They're a great partner. So is Pheasants and Quail Forever. I mean, those are folks that we do a lot of work with. They're going to be really integral. They're going to be on the team of our turkey habitat initiative, right? What makes good turkey habitat often makes good quail habitat. Makes great pollinator habitat, things like that, stuff that they're really passionate about. And then an NGO, or I don't even know if they're an NGO, a group that's coming on and gaining more prominence are these prescribed burn associations. So they're popping up all across the state. There's a new one in central Missouri that went from non-existent to a year later. They've got 150 members that are ready to roll up their sleeves and go do some prescribed burns. And so those are user groups and organizations that I really want to tie in with, right? We're all pointing the same direction. We just need to make sure that we're doing it together. As many partners as we can get, I'm all for it.
Yeah. So burning and trapping seem to be the two kind of cultural things within the hunting community that we keep pushing on, and it keeps gaining momentum, which is great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Do you think is there a path forward with the FSA or NRCS, much like the pollinator program? I mean, they're specific there, trying to help the bee population. Do you think there's ever something that would be the wild turkey program to where they tailor a, CRP contract to the wild turkey habitat, or all ground nesters?
Yeah, I don't know. That's certainly something, we've got a Farm Bill program coordinator who, that's a lot of the work that she does is really trying to make sure that the practices that are out there are meeting the wide suite of wildlife related needs. And I think, some of this stuff, again, like I mentioned earlier, is part of what got, the momentum behind, mid-contract management things needing to happen for CRP. There's always conversations about, what are the limitations that are put on a program that might prevent someone from managing them in a way. And so it may not necessarily even be the program itself, but sometimes it's trying to influence the guidelines and the guidance around in which, it can be implemented. And so, yeah, that's a pretty important one. But there's a lot of focus on ground nesting birds, certainly, and from a national level, even more, globally, as we start to think about the interconnection here with broader conservation things. We recognize that, there's a recent report that, over the last couple of decades, we've lost, more than 3 billion birds, right, worldwide. Lost more than 3 billion birds. You look at most of those birds are ground nesting and grassland associated birds, right? So
just because the habitat's
just because it's changed so much. So you talk about grouse, you talk about whippoorwills, you talk about wild turkeys, quail, those species that quite honestly require a lot of disturbance, a lot of active management that historically was there, at least in patches, that with the way that we manage the landscape now just doesn't exist in the same way. And so for us to do it back, or at least create, it in that way, we got to have a lot of disturbance. And that's why, and Nick's right, the Prescribed Burn Association is getting up and rolling. That's a real huge gap to help landowners work together. It takes a decent-sized crew of folks that know what they're doing to pull off some of these burns. And so the ability to support one another, I think, is really cool, right? They're like, hey, let's rally together and support each other in that effort. And the other thing I've noticed, in the last 4 or 5 years is that the NGOs really starting to partner together too, right? And think about how they collectively work together. And Nick mentioned Quail and Pheasants Forever, absolutely a huge partner for us. We've got positions that are partially funded through the Department of Conservation and through NRCS that again add to the amount of habitat acres that can go on the land by providing technical assistance to landowners. So, there's good ones and even some unusual ones. DU came to us not long ago and wanted to start partnering on some grassland conservation things, so they're starting to recognize what's this broader interplay. And certainly Turkeys for Tomorrow is getting themselves stood up. There's plenty of room for everybody, right? There's more than enough room, and they're, selling a very similar message. It's about habitat management. Let's do habitat management and some predator control on top of it. And so they've certainly got some attention and positive momentum there. So I think folks are trying to do what they can.
We had Ron Jolly on from Turkeys for Tomorrow a couple weeks back, and he was talking about the trapping side. Do you recall, Tim, how many they gave away? How many traps that they gave away?
I don't remember, but they ran out. They had to order more.
Was it 60,000 or?
I don't even.
I mean, it was an insane amount in that program. So they're trying to increase those efforts, and so they're doing some really really cool stuff over there. And the type of programs that they're trying to fund, I guess, research for. The guys at Mossy Oak with the
turkey stamp,
and even the Mr. Fox turkey vest. They're really trying to help fund a lot of different conservation programs across the country, not just in the Southeast or wherever it may be. So it's neat to see these popping up, and it's kind of like you've mentioned it's the hunting population not just relying solely on the departments, but also taking kind of their future into their own hands and saying, hey, let's get assertive here and be proactive instead of saying, hey, we just don't have any more turkey numbers. I think it plays to the fact of how much people love the wild turkey and beyond that, just conservation in general. And it's neat to see just the community kind of rise up around it.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's encouraging, right? That folks are there ready and willing to partner, and we are too. You know, how can we work together to continue to manage something that so many of us love and enjoy?
You touched on it briefly a little bit ago, but do you get a lot of pushback regarding the actual dates, the season dates? I mean, I hear it from time to time, but you know, I don't know if that's like one magic swoop is going to fix things, you know?
No, we don't. You know, quite honestly, the in the spring, the biggest thing we continue to hear is why haven't we just gone ahead and gone to all day turkey hunting? You know, that's the one place we don't hear. You know,
because of broken marriages. Like,
Yeah.
how much strife that would cause.
What is the thought process around the 1 o'clock stop time each day?
Yeah, it's all ties into, you know, trying not to disrupt breeding activity.
Gotcha.
Allow birds the afternoon to do what they need to do, get safely into the roost, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's where the term afternoon delight originates from, if I'm correct. There's a
call
song
BS.
about that.
Yeah, it was a very early regulation in terms of a very conservative approach to doing it, and that's kind of where we've been for the last several years.
What about the bag limit? I mean, 2, you know, versus 1. I mean, is there anything there?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So we've looked at it, and it's only about 5% of people actually fill that second tag. So decreasing the bag limit from 2 birds to 1 would remove a whole bunch of opportunity, right? So you finish filling your first tag, you're done for the season. But it wouldn't actually really remove that much as far as like the overall harvest total.
Gotcha.
So that's.
And so then the big one that we folks certainly have concern about is the fall season, right? The realization we're shooting some additional hens in the fall. What does that impact have on the population? And in many ways too, like Nick mentioned, we're kind of in this spot where it's relatively small. And I don't know, you mentioned how many turkeys we'd trapped and tagged in North Missouri over several years to kind of look at what harvest rates were. And in most cases, we think hen harvests probably have to be in excess of 10% in the fall to have a noticeable impact on the population, but we're way, way, way less than that.
Yeah, 1%, like 5 or 6 birds out of 1,000 tagged birds.
Oh, really?
Harvested.
How many fall turkeys are harvested in a year?
Yeah, so overall last year, I just have the last year numbers off the top of my head. About 4,500 total birds, and then about 2,500 of those were reported as hens, either adult or jennies.
Gotcha.
And that's across the state.
Yeah, and we know there's a little bit of inaccuracy with the proper reporting of sex in the fall harvest as well. Folks don't see they don't properly identify, especially young of the year, little male poult. They're not poults, but juvenile males in the fall harvest as females. And so again, we're talking about 2,500. And the fall season is something that culturally some folks just absolutely enjoy. I mean, I know folks who don't hardly hunt any other season, but absolutely love to grab a shotgun and go hunt at some time in the fall. And so it's a bit of this balance of, yeah, we know harvesting a hen has an impact, right? But her annual survival is 50% or so, and we're harvesting a very, very small number. And there are a lot of people who enjoy doing it, so we get stuck in a little bit of this, tough
tradition.
spot, right? Of it's not majorly hurting anything.
Yeah.
And if we took it away, all we'd be doing, unfortunately, is taking some opportunity away from folks. And so I certainly understand the sentiments of folks saying, "Hey, take it away from us, so we don't shoot some turkeys in the fall." But to hope that would fix the turkey population.
I mean, that's a pretty small number in general.
Right?
Yeah. So.
Yeah, we figured it up. It's it's like one turkey per 30 square miles. So I mean, it is, but it is an easy talking point too for folks who say, well, just we got to do everything we possibly can to continue to make sure we're not over harvesting them, and we're not. We're not.
The only thing I would say about our current dates in Missouri is I would be willing to take my kids out of school for maybe a Monday and a Tuesday if we expanded the youth season a little bit. because it's such a tight little window.
And if the
there.
weather
It's weather
sucks like we
dependent.
saw this year, and I know the latest email that you guys sent out, it was talking about how bad Saturday was, and the numbers were
So
down a little
windy.
bit. But Sunday was great. You know, there was a big bounce back, but I could see that but they get to hunt. You know, they get to use that tag in the regular season if they didn't fill it. So they still have plenty of opportunity, really.
Yeah, they do, and that certainly is one of the reasons why an all-day season would be, or at least some portion of the season, you know, the last 2 weeks or whatever the season, being all day would be advantageous to again provide some additional opportunities, because we consistently hear, and it's not, you know, it's not unexpected that time is just the biggest constraint,
Yeah.
and when you're limited to just hunting in the mornings, hunting in the afternoons isn't bad. It can be good and productive, but again, that opportunity to expose more youth to the outdoors is something we've been weighing pretty seriously. But you know, coupled with no doubt folks' concerns about a liberalization of the season at a time when
Sure.
perception is turkey population isn't doing great,
Yeah.
right? And we don't know whether that's a fair assessment or not. And I think part of this discussion, too, is us sort of trying to get a grasp on what's the turkey population going to actually look like long term. It's not going to be what it was in 2000.
Yeah.
But
We've heard that before from, well, I think it was Dr. Chamberlain was talking about that. This is pretty much a typical thing. You see the big boom and the top end of the bell curve, but that's not where it sustains then.
right, yeah. So is this the bottom? Is it somewhere above this? You know, what would that look like? And so then what does reasonable opportunity start to look like in terms of, you know, season structure and things like that?
And opportunity is a major component. It's a major part of the equation, because you think about opportunity, and at least perceived opportunity, also has a connection with license sales, which has a connection with dollars available to support the research, to make sure there's opportunity. So there's so many components to this. I know it's really not sexy to say, well, the answer is multifactorial. That doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. So when people tune into a podcast looking for the smoking gun for turkeys, it's like, well, we don't have it, because real life is more complicated than that. And so buckle in, learn to deal with the complexity and the nuanced nature of population dynamics, and then we can get somewhere. But that just requires a little more commitment, and I think that's what we're seeing in turkey hunters, is that, man, we're a passionate crew, and we're willing to dig into the weeds.
When you guys dig into the numbers, are there different parts of the state that have, you know, the populations seemingly doing better, or do you ever think about changing up the bag limits for different parts of the state? You know, you guys have to manage it for the entire state. I understand that's one broad brush, you know, that could be difficult, because we see it for the whitetails too. But on whitetails, there are some different restrictions, point restrictions here, and, you know, CWD counties, and there's certain things that you do in that regard, but you don't really see it for turkeys, right? Does it make sense to go down that path? Is there any data that would show that would even help?
Yeah, we're looking at it. Nick, you might talk a little bit about the project we got going on, the gobbler harvest.
Yeah, well, so part of that project is just looking at harvest rates. So that we have a project going on where we're tagging turkeys in a couple of different regions in Missouri to just look at the overall harvest rate. So, right, the number of tags returned from a known population gives us this harvest rate, which is a more useful piece of information, just overall harvest. Because then we can even leverage that to look at kind of the harvest numbers and do that math on it. So far, what we're seeing is harvest rates are pretty good and consistent in those regions. There's definitely regions of the state that harvest more birds, though. The way I kind of think of it is along the Missouri River, north of the Missouri River, and along the Mississippi River, and then maybe there's some core, like, very high levels of harvest in kind of like the well-managed Ozarks, parts of the Ozarks that we see folks doing the work. But yeah, I mean, sort of the northwest corner of the state has seen fairly poor production, which has resulted in fairly low harvest relative to where it once was, and then the western prairie side of the state. Yeah, it's a conversation I have with our Game and Regs Commission and the Wild Turkey Working Group as far as, can we break these into zones? Can we be a little more proactive about regulations that way? But ultimately, our spring turkey harvest isn't Right, we're taking the males out of the population after we hope most of the breeding has been done. That's why the season is set the way it is. So there's not a ton of benefit we think we would get out of changing the regulations at various regions. But what it would do is, it'd add complexity, and it would potentially turn off that new hunter from being like, okay, I want to go turkey hunting, and they're like, okay, here's 10 things you need to think about instead of 3. And they go,
Sure.
I don't know, maybe next year.
Yeah. Yep.
We do definitely look at it. We've got defined turkey productivity regions, based on the landscape, the makeup of it, the habitat condition that we look at productivity on, right, and harvest and trends in that similar way. It's just that, that they're a different critter than a deer in terms of production and management. So we haven't gone to that point or felt like there was, a reasonable justification to have some either one different season dates or different bag limits.
How much of the funding is generated from donations versus like the tag? Like, as I think about this often when I go to buy my tags for the year, not just for turkeys, but for whitetails. And it's like, do you want this, special stamp or this or that? And I'm always like, yeah, sure. Because I feel like my dollars are going to help fund research or whatever it is to help the habitat or the wildlife. And so is there a direct correlation to like this study that you guys are doing? And does the tag, my dollars that I invest in the tag, does it help go back to the studies that you're doing, or how does that work?
So all the revenue goes into the commission fund, right? And so then the commission, the Missouri Department of Conservation Commission, essentially determines how all of that gets allocated. Mm-hmm. It's not earmarked for, if it's, deer or turkey tags, it's not earmarked for those specific species. Where we see most of the benefit really is through PR, wildlife restoration dollars, on the excise tax on ammo and firearm sales and archery equipment. That's a huge source of revenue back. Where permit sales really matter from that is that's a factor in the amount of money we are eligible to get back. So the higher that number is, the higher the allocation that comes back. And so a lot of our big game species research does qualify for the wildlife restoration grant program. And so we will use those dollars. I mean, those are our agency dollars, and that they are to come back to the agency in some way, shape, or form. And so a lot of these big expensive projects, the whitetail deer research projects, the elk restoration project, our black bear research project, a lot of those are through wildlife restoration dollars. And so that additional contributions that hunters are making, or just shooters, folks who are just shooting ammo, is another important way. And then the money that goes to, to NGOs a lot of times gets leveraged or paired with agency funds, to do a particular project. They chip in part, and we can chip in part. And in many cases, they're smaller little seed kinds of projects. So it's really important, and that really diverse way of funding these conservation programs can be helpful because we can be more creative in the way that we can get conservation put on the ground.
Can some of those organizations do things that you guys are not able to do? Is there any kind of, just red tape that you can't get around that they can, or does that even exist really?
Yeah, I can't tell you. We try to get around red tape, but no, they can absolutely support us in capacity. Right. And so in many ways, it's advantageous for us. Like I mentioned, we've got partner positions with nearly every NGO. They have funding. We have some funding. They have additional capacity a lot of times to support the staff member coming on board. We certainly have agency limitations. And so it's a great way to get more boots on the ground. They can come up with dollars in very creative ways, for example, from NRCS, that they may be able to support an additional position. So we can pool money from various places and get somebody on the ground to work on habitat management related things. So, yeah, I would say the conservation community, not unlike the hunting community, is very creative in their attempt to accomplish the goal. And so we try to facilitate that as much as possible.
Yeah. Mark, any parting shots before we wrap up?
Well, yeah, I would say this. If we would have had this podcast, say in 18 or 19, when I felt like population was really getting stressed after those poor years there in 16 and 17. I might have pushed back a little bit on their position of basically staying the course. Stay the course and continue the practices that we've been doing. However, we've had some decent hatches, at least up here that I've seen, and I don't know what it looks like statewide, but 22, we had a very good hatch. 21, I thought was the best hatch we'd had, and 20 was decent. So I feel like if we had another decent hatch here in 23, we'd be in a little bit of an upward ramp in terms of overall population based on what I'm seeing. I don't know what these guys feel, but I guess my question would be, if we get back into those ruts that we had 16, 17, and all of a sudden the hatches are so bad that the numbers continue to drop, at what point do you either reduce the bag limit or push the season back even a little bit further? Or, at what point do you take some steps like Tennessee's taken, South Carolina, Mississippi? Some of these states have pushed their season back and reduced bag limits here the last few years.
Yeah, I think that's where us just, getting back to spending a lot more time and energy really monitoring the population and really understanding what some of those drivers are. And yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's what stimulated that first 7-year research project that we did up in North Missouri, was to make sure we understood what exactly was going on, or at least as best as we could, to inform those decisions that you mentioned, season timing and bag limits. Those are the two levers from a regulatory standpoint that we can pull. The other side of it is that we can certainly, on MDC-owned and managed lands, start doing better habitat management that encourages good brood rearing habitat, and then through our Turkey Habitat Initiative, start to encourage landowners and others to implement similar practices that are beneficial to turkey. So not a one or the other, but like in most of this, it's a yes and what else can we do?
Do you guys know on the public land population of hunters, what percentage of the overall hunter does that represent in the state of Missouri? So you hear about it a lot. I hear about it, the hunting public and this and that and the other, but what does it actually represent? And I know that there's a lot of private land and privately owned land, but what percentage of the hunter does that represent too?
Yeah, so I think it's a majority. I mean, for sure, a majority of birds are harvested on private land in Missouri. Now, that's mostly just volume of land, of course. I don't have the number off the top of my head. Certain counties, right, especially in the Ozarks, where we start to see big tracts of national forest, we start to see a higher proportion. It's pretty variable. Somewhere like Callaway County is probably almost entirely private land. Pretty variable.
Yeah. I don't know what the turkey numbers are, but about 10% of our deer hunters hunt only on public land.
Gotcha.
About 25% of them report having hunted on public land at some point in time during the hunting season. Mm-hmm. And I think the number for turkey hunters is actually higher that hunt on public land at some point in time. I don't recall what the exact number is, but that's where we stand, at least for deer hunters.
And you guys are aggressively managing habitat across the state to help, obviously, with the turkey populations on things that you can control.
Yeah, absolutely. And our staff, right? Our staff are constantly asking, okay, what habitat condition does that look like? What should I be managing for? Here's some of the things we've been trying to accomplish. And so there's been a real evolution, even with our staff, in terms of the kinds of practices they've been implementing, the frequency of burning. Like I said, a decade ago, nobody was doing summer and fall burns. Some of our grassland folks were, where we were getting, heavy woody encroachment into some of our grasslands in the prairie southwest part of the state. But nobody really was doing much of that. It's happening a lot more. Good. Our staff are recognizing the frequency in which intervals to re-entering a stand to create that good herbaceous layer. And so there's a collective learning here really within the community as to what the needs are of turkeys and a whole host of other species that benefit from that real critical component.
Yeah, that's it right there. That habitat improvement and habitat management is so critical. And the more education you get out there, the more turkeys we're going to have. There's no question about it. One thing we haven't talked about, but I hear about it in hunting circles, is the avian flu or avian disease have anything to do with perhaps the decline in turkey populations? Do you think there's any correlation, or are there any studies that show it does?
So I've talked to our state vet a little bit about this because it's a question I get from folks. And kind of the turkey's behavior makes it a little less susceptible to it. Right? They're not in these 10,000 bird flocks like your waterfowl are. The way they move across the landscape makes it a little less likely that avian flu will be a population driver. I think the last I heard, they have found avian flu in a couple of birds. But some of those birds are actually hunter harvested. So they were healthy enough birds on the landscape that they were able to be harvested by a hunter, which, could point to the fact that turkeys can have avian influenza and it won't kill them like other birds, right? So a lot of our waterfowl carry avian influenza, but it doesn't actually kill them. It's when we get into things like black vultures and birds of prey that we start to see avian influenza having an effect. So I'm cautiously optimistic and definitely keeping my eye on the literature about avian influenza, but I don't think at this point, knowing what we know now, that it's going to be one of those population drivers.
One other question, we talk about it in our circles up here, that, we do an annual shed hunt, and we've been doing that for probably 25 years, 15, 20 guys canvassing, looking for all the sheds we can. And we used to find a bird or two, a kill site, a dead gobbler, dead hen, whatever it was. Now anymore, it seems like we find quite a few dead turkeys on our shed hunt that had been killed during the winter at some point. And the other thing we've seen is just more bobcats than we've ever seen ever. On our trail cameras while we're hunting. Is there any correlation, or do you feel as if the bobcat population is on the rise? It seems like it is to us.
Yeah, I think so. I think according to our bow hunter observation surveys, so we ask bow hunters to just keep an eye out for a variety of critters when they're in a stand. I think that's shown at least a slight incline in the bobcat population. But there's also been, again, since the 80s, right, we got rid of DDT. Our birds of prey populations are some of the few bird populations in the country that have actually increased as well. So there's almost certainly more of those great horned owls. There's obviously a lot more eagles on the landscape, and those birds, well, I don't know about eagles, but certainly great horned owls they're adult turkey predators, which there's not that many of those, and we've seen big increases in those populations.
Great point. So back to Jason's comment earlier, and I've heard Dr. Chamberlain make it as well. It's death by 1,000 cuts.
Yep.
Think of all the things we've discussed in this podcast. Like I said, they're all a miracle when you see one walking by. We just got to do everything we can to create more miracles.
Yeah, I think of habitat as a way of tilting the balance back in the hen's favor, right? So if you give her enough of what she's looking for, what she thinks she needs, then maybe she can make that miracle happen. If you constrain her to a little postage stamp surrounded by bad habitat, that's not a recipe for success.
Yeah, amen.
Great way to sum it up.
Any parting shots for you guys before we leave here? Anything you want to leave us with that we haven't touched on, or?
No, I just say thank you guys again for the opportunity. I always appreciate the opportunity to share the word, have an open and honest conversation about what we know, what we don't know, and some of the constraints that go into our decision-making process. I think it's it's tough sometimes to reflect to the public the level of detail and due diligence we do try to put into making decisions. And so I always appreciate you guys giving us the opportunity to come on and talk about this super challenging topic. And I would just encourage folks to think about what can they do. And they can pick up a chainsaw and drip torch. And certainly when opportunities arise, there's nothing wrong with trapping a few small predators either. So.
Yeah, and for me, I'd say feel free to get a hold of me, right? I may regret that later whenever my inbox blows up, but
no one watches this show, so there's no danger of that.
But that's part of my job. That's something that I enjoy so far as interacting with the people, right? I think it's easy to see some of the negativity and get down on it, but I try to flip the script and think of that. Those are passionate people who just want to learn a little bit more, understand what's going on, understand where the decisions are being made. And those are folks that I like to talk to for sure. So reach out.
And to that note, one thing that we do is we communicate amongst the community quite frequently, right? So Nick is a member of the Midwest and Southeast Deer Technical Task Force. I serve as a director's liaison to the Midwest Deer and Turkey Task Force. And so there's a high level of collaboration and communication that occurs amongst biologists in neighboring states. So that we try to stay apprised of, what the challenges are, what they're working on, what solutions they're trying to come up with, sharing information so that, hey, somebody's doing a project, let's understand what they find from it. Does it fit with what we're seeing or not? And so, yeah, that level of collaboration and communication happens in a lot of cases weekly, if not monthly, amongst staff across state lines.
Good.
I wonder if you could take that collaboration to the next step. You know, like one of the programs, and it was with your introduction, Jason, was the DMAP program that we've started on. And our communication with Kevin is at an all-time high. We communicate back and forth via email. He gives us ideas on how to implement that program. I assume it's been met with great success statewide. I hope it has. Yeah. Would something like that, of course, you're not trying to harvest more hens like we are in DMAP. We're trying to take more antlerless deer, more does. But would that make sense to have those types of communication from the MDC talking about these programs we're talking about on this podcast and pointing people to the right resources to take the steps to, to the drip torch and the chainsaw and take it to the next step and more trapping? Something like that, I think, would be well thought of and well received out there.
Yeah, I think that's part of what we're trying to work through kind of the early stages of the Turkey Habitat Initiative. What might that look like? We have defined conservation opportunity areas in the state in which we try to focus our work. We can't work everywhere. I mean, there's conservation opportunity occurs throughout the state, but in terms of where's the most bang for our buck, where's especially in places that have, threatened or endangered species, where's our opportunity to do the best management? And so we're trying to think about where we've prioritized habitat management efforts already. What's the turkey component of that need to look like? And so it'll probably end up in some kind of, I hate to say turkey focus areas, but some priority areas where the opportunity is greatest with alignment of landowners, alignment of public lands. Kind of like we've done, we've created quail restoration landscapes that are really aligned around our grassland opportunity areas. And so there is some opportunity to think about who is that community around that focal landscape, what kind of communications might they need. And that's where the prescribed burn associations too that Nick mentioned are a really critical component. Many of those have our staff as part of the team, and they're really heavily integrated in terms of the communication. But yeah, certainly, no doubt, getting communications out and the right kind of communications is a challenge we all face, and we don't always do the best job at it. So we're continuing to try to improve those efforts.
That's awesome. Whenever your research is complete, we would invite you to bring those results to us. We'd love to have another podcast like this so we can share it at least to our audience and hopefully let it expand from there. I know you have many avenues, but we'd certainly love to share it to our viewers and listeners when that day arrives.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow.
All right.
Talk about a deep dive on a complex issue.
Hell, I feel like we just barely scratched the surface.
It feels that way sometimes, doesn't it?
Yeah. We've been talking for probably an hour and a half, and we could go on for 4 or 5 more hours, but it's certainly, we've covered a broad spectrum, and you guys we're so appreciative of you taking the time to come on. This was really, really informative. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you guys for having us.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it.
All right. Well, we'll finish this one up, and we'll promise to do another one in the future. I'd like to have you, the appropriate people back in and start talking whitetails here soon. So it's always a topic.
Turn the page.
Yeah, that's right. We're fixing to turn the page and start thinking whitetails a little more heavily here in the next few months. So again, we appreciate it. And if you guys ever need anything from us, we're here to help.
Thanks. Yep. Get rested up.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
All right. Till next time.
See ya.
Peace out.
DeerCast is now supercharged with maps. Get ahead of your game with killer new features like live Doppler radar, wind check out to 5 days, virtual rain gauges, GPS path tracking, and more. Plus, get our 14-day revolutionary DeerCast prediction and access to DeerCast Track. Prep, predict, and pursue with DeerCast.
We're adding new videos every week, so make sure to click that subscribe button and check out all of our amazing content. This episode of DoD TV was brought to you by Leupold.